evening. Just before we kick off, there's a few people just signing on as I talk. Perhaps if one or two of you could put confirmation that you can hear me in the question facility you've got in your GoToWebinar toolbar, I'd be grateful. Just a smiley face or a yes, I can hear you or something like that just before I get started. Lovely. Sounds good. Sounds like the sound's working. So this evening's webinar technically is an audio one-way only broadcast. So however you've got your system set up, you should obviously be able to hear me. You should also be able to see an opening slide on the screen and then successive slides going through this evening's session. But however loud you shout or frantically you wave, I can't hear or see you, which is just one of those things. It makes it easier to control the session. So in fairness, if you've got any questions, which most evenings we get quite a few, if you just type them in at any stage into the toolbar facility you've got, at the end of the session I'll let you know when we've come to the end. For those that need to disappear on time, you're more than welcome to leave. But if you want to listen to the answers to questions, irrespective of whether you've asked one or not, you're more than welcome to stay on. And I will normally get round to answering everybody's questions, so it isn't a potluck. Normally I'll deal with everybody. If you're prepared to hang on, I'll answer your questions. There's been one or two already, and one of which is worth just repeating, that if there are any contractors on board or people looking for contract work rather than permanent, we will touch on that to some degree. Principles are very similar. What we'll go through tonight is very similar, whether you're looking for contract work or permanent. But I'll touch on that later. So we'll kick things off because an awful lot of stuff to go through. So this will be quite a fast-paced session. I'll be covering a lot of ground, and the bottom line is talking about how to write an effective CV and a LinkedIn profile. The principles are very similar between the two. I'll be focusing more on the CV element because a lot of what you'll learn about writing a CV will be able to be ported across to LinkedIn. But there are some specific issues with LinkedIn that are worth talking about. And the content will, and I'll try to get you to reflect and think about your own CV. So it's a bit of a self-diagnostic thing as well. We'll kick off this evening's session really talking a little bit about what people tend to do on their CV, why is that wrong, and then we'll move on to how to correct it and put together a good structure for a CV. So as I say, any questions, one or two just last to people joined in the last few minutes. If you've got any questions, rattle them into the facilities you've got on your toolbar, and I'll deal with them at the end of the session. Right, well, let's kick off and get started. So first of all, very briefly, who on earth are we? You've been invited via Talent Spa. The business I work for is called CV and Interview Advisors. Unsurprisingly, we provide individuals with help, guidance, and the skills to be able to write their CVs and LinkedIn profiles, interview coaching, interview preparation, things like that. The reason why I mention that, and also my own background, is not to big myself up or our company, or obviously I'm here to an extent to show you our wares. But the reality is I want to give you the confidence that we know what we're talking about. What we do and what I'll be talking about this evening, if you put it into practice or if you engaged our services to put it into practice, it fundamentally makes a difference. It works. We know that. It's proven time and time again. And I have some evidence to show you later to substantiate that. So the main message is we didn't just wake up this morning thinking it would be a great idea to host a webinar and talk to people about stuff we didn't really understand. We've been doing this for a number of years, and we do it day in, day out, and I personally probably reviewed nigh on 10,000 CVs now, and we know, and we talk to recruiters and employers, we understand what works, what doesn't, and why it doesn't work. Key thing about this evening, a number of key things actually, but one key thing, I'm going to be talking about a few cliches, I'm afraid, hot skills being one of them. Hot skills change and evolve over time. They're different for every marketplace, every sector, even sometimes different levels of role, of course. But knowing what they are in your sector at the level that you're at is really important. If you don't know what employers are looking for and consequently what recruiters are looking for on their behalf, you're automatically on the back foot. So it's really important to get a grasp of what people are looking for, what people will be excited about if they saw it on your CV. Okay, enough about us. I promised some evidence of our abilities. This is a an email, or an extract from an email, I should say, to be super accurate, that we got last month, and it was from somebody who attended one of these webinars, and they'd been really struggling. I won't read out the text verbatim, you can see it for yourselves, but essentially this individual had been really struggling in the marketplace for a few years. They technically were quite a competent individual. There's nothing particularly about them that made them unemployable, but their CV was truly atrocious, and nobody had bothered to tell them in almost 3 years of applying for jobs. Nobody had sat them down or told them over the telephone or emailed them to say, look, the reason you're not getting interest and attention is because your CV is just a hideous reflection on your abilities. This person, almost in desperation, attended one of our webinars. Not sure what that says about our webinars, but there you go. Make of it what you will. And we were able to help them put into practice some changes, following the steps you're going to learn about this evening. All of a sudden, and it was almost overnight, they submitted their new CV to the various job boards, recruiters, etc., and started getting interest and attention. It was that black and white. So it does work. Now, I promised that we'd take a bit of a diagnostic look at where life might be right now for your CV, and we'll do that just very briefly because it is important. So some of the things that people tend to do wrong, or some of the things you should ask yourself about your own CV, so you can start to make a decision on whether you actually need to do anything or not. Because if your CV is doing its job, and we'll define what doing its job is very shortly, you don't need to worry, and you can get on with your life and apply for jobs, and all should be well. But if you follow some of these criteria, or you feel that your CV fits into some of these criteria, then you should probably pause and reflect and think maybe you're not approaching it from the right point of view. Now, the first of those things is a bit of a warning sign, if you like. If you're going to market with essentially just a list of stuff, so if your CV looks like just a list of jobs that you've performed, educational qualifications, be they academic or professional, that you've secured, how people can get hold of you, hobbies and interests, and it's literally just a list-based piece of information, that is a warning sign. And the reason why it's a warning sign is because it's not actually really telling anybody anything except the black and white information. And if you're a recruiter and you've been sifting through literally hundreds of CVs for one job, and all they are lists of things that the people have done, you tend to see lots of similar information. So let's just imagine that you're, let's say, an accountant, for want of a better profession, and you're saying that you're responsible for doing VAT and dealing with HMRC, if you're in the UK, or any other tax authority, and analysing profit and loss, balances, reconciliations. Any accountant will probably have similar responsibilities. They'll be able to produce a similar list of information. It's not differentiating you at all. So as a recruiter and employer, if all you're faced with is individuals whose names are different, but in terms of what they're presenting to their marketplace is very similar, just a list of things, it's really hard to decide who to interview or not. So that's one warning sign. So ask yourself that question, is that what you're going to market with? The other warning sign, which a lot of people fall into a trap of, is whether you're using a format of CV that is essentially the same as you had when you left education. Now, this is a real problem if you left education in the 70s, 80s, or even the 90s now. And by education, I mean whatever was your most recent education. So that could be college, school, university, doesn't really matter. But if you've set up a CV and pretty much all you've done is add to it and refine it a little bit over that time, that's a big warning sign, because things have moved on and changed. Even if you've just graduated or left school or college and you've got a format of CV that's something that you've just found on the internet or picked up from a relative or a friend, that is probably a warning sign for reasons that will become clear later this evening. And if you don't know the hot skills in your marketplace, and the hot skills vary, so it's very hard to say to you the hot skills are these, because they vary across sectors, but they're typically the 5 or 6 things that an employer is really looking for in an individual that they'd be excited by and almost compelled to interview you if you had them, or it's certainly defined whether you'd be up for interview or not, whether you have those skills. If you don't know what those skills are, it's highly unlikely your CV is aligned to them, and it's really important that that ought to be the case. So you might find it hard to answer the question, is your CV aligned to the hot skills in your marketplace? Because if come on to that later as well, because what are skills and what recruiters and employers are looking for from the CV normally differ quite a bit from what individuals have actually put on their paperwork. Another cliche this evening, it's going to crop up a few times, target audience. Who is your target audience is a fair question. Now, it's a variety of people. It's primarily whoever's making the decision about who's going to get interviews or not. Now, that could be a recruiter, it could be some other intermediary, it could be the hiring manager, or it could be a combination of those three, plus a few more besides. But it is quite a difficult job, but you have to get that document, your CV, well positioned for the target audience. You've got to, in an ideal world, get inside their head and think, what are they looking for? What is going to interest them? What's going to compel them to want to interview me? And pull together a CV that's as close a fit as you can actually get without overstepping the mark of legal, decent and honest, if you like. What this is building up to, and the third cliche of the evening, is that whatever you do, your CV should present to its target audience a strong business case as to why somebody should be thinking of interviewing you. Forget about hiring at this stage, that might be entering their minds, but principally the job of the CV is to get you interviews, not jobs per se. So our view is you need to present to your audience, whoever that may be, a strong justification, a business case as to why they should be interested in you. Now, if you think about anything that you've bought recently, like a fairly high-priced item, I guess, so anything from a kitchen appliance right the way up to a car or a house, you won't have bought it based simply on a list of things. So nobody goes out, or I've never met anybody yet, who goes out and buys a car on the basis of it being 2 meters wide, 1.5 meters tall and 5 meters long, and somebody having presented a list of that saying, you know, our Ford Mondeo or whatever is this long, this tall, this wide. Are you interested? Oh yeah, I am. It's the perfect dimensions. That just doesn't happen. You buy a car, house, kitchen appliance because of some kind of either an emotional tie, arguably less so with a kitchen appliance, or a brand loyalty, or a message, or some kind of features and benefits that have been explained to you through some medium or other, which you have believed, reconciled in your mind, and then made a decision, a purchasing decision. If you're working and you need to go and spend some money on behalf of your company, you can't just poll up to the finance director or the finance manager or the MD or the owner and say, give me £500,000 because I've just thought of something really good to buy. They're going to want to know what on earth you're going to do with that money. They're going to want a business case putting together. You need to view yourselves as being a product or service to somebody who has a problem that needs solving. And as a return for them investing X amount of money in your salary or daily rate or hourly rate or whatever it is, you are going to return to them, or at least give them an idea of the return that you can provide. So your CV has to be that justification, that business case. And you can probably see now that a bad CV, therefore, is a list of things, just a list of things, and a good CV is some kind of justification as why somebody should be interested in you. And I can virtually guarantee that most people on this evening session will not be in a position of presenting a business case to their audience. And the reason why I can be so confident about that is because most of the CVs I review day in, day out are nowhere near presenting that business case. If, however, you are presenting a strong business case, you're probably one of the ones that are getting a lot of interviews and success. Now, the comment at the bottom of this slide in red is interesting because a lot of people tend to ask us during these sessions or towards the end, okay, you're going on about fixing a CV, and a lot of people are not convinced that making a change to the CV can make a big difference. And they particularly think, well, how can anybody outside of me write a better CV than me because I've done the work and lived the life? And that's a fair argument, except that most people are way too close to their own jobs and don't understand what's going on in the employment market. They think they do, but they don't. And we'll come on to how you can assess that very, very shortly, because there's an absolutely key acid test that will help you determine whether your CV is doing its job or not. But in terms of, if you, like the chap whose email I showed you earlier, who said, yeah, put into practice, what you've said, you've helped me out, thanks very much, it's worked. Typically, You get your CV sorted. If you do it yourself, if you can do it competently, or get somebody else to do it, but however you do it, you arrive at market with a good, effective CV, a strong business case as to why somebody should be considering interviewing you. Typically, from our stats, you'll see a 30 to 50% increase in your success rate at getting interviews. It's that dramatic. Now, for some people, it's stratospherically above that, like that chap who'd been struggling for 3 years with no interest, then suddenly getting a number of interviews. So his increase is in the hundreds, if not thousands of percent. But on average, it's in that 30 to 50% kind of range. So it's quite impressive. And I promised I'd give you a sort of an acid test for whether your CV is doing its job or not. So again, reflect on this. If you're active in the job market now, or have been active recently, this is going to be very easy because you'll have the stats. So as I said earlier, the test of the CV, not everybody understands this actually. A lot of people think the CV is doing a far more complicated job than it is. Its key purpose in life is to get you in front of people, to get a discussion or some kind of engagement going about the job you've applied for. Let's call all of that engagement an interview. And by interview, I mean a meaningful interview with somebody about that specific job, not a random interview with a recruiter who thought they might like to see you about something else or had other motives lurking around. They don't really count. So if you think about all the applications you've made, and as long as you're applying for jobs that are a reasonable, logical extension of what you're currently doing. So if you're going from supermarket checkout operator to nuclear submarine captain, it doesn't matter what anybody does with your CV, that's not going to happen. But if you're going from supermarket checkout operator to supermarket checkout supervisor, then that's plainly a legitimate move, or would appear to be. If you're going from junior accountant to senior accountant, or project manager to program manager, or IT manager to IT director, or finance manager or controller to finance director, they're logical moves. There might be a bit of a stretch, that's fine. As long as you think you could perform those roles and you're applying for them, let's say you apply for 10 jobs, clearly if you're getting 8, 9, 10 interviews for those 10 jobs, so 80, 90% hit rate, there's not a lot wrong with your CV. It's doing its job. That's the acid test. If, however, you're not getting any interviews for those jobs, which you know you could technically perform, a lot of people get mixed up now and they think, well, it's because of the state of the economy or there's lots of other applicants. Now, all of those things may be true, but what it doesn't hide, or what you shouldn't be deviated from, is thinking the only reason people aren't selecting you for interview, doesn't matter how competitive the market is, doesn't matter how many jobs there are or aren't, if you're applying for them and you're not getting interviews, somebody's looked at your CV, because it's pretty much the only measure they have of you, and they don't like what they see. And that comes as a bit of a shock to some people. It's very simple when you think about it, but a lot of people think, well, okay, I thought I wasn't getting interviews because I was overqualified, underqualified, there were better people for the job. Now, all of those sound like plausible reasons, but you can't escape from the fact that if you're not getting interviews, it's because somebody didn't like the message on your CV. So in reading the CV, they have decided, rightly or wrongly, that you are overqualified or underqualified, or that's all smoke and mirrors, because in effect what they're saying is your CV was awful, but we don't have the strength of character. I was going to say something ruder then, but the strength of character to advise you that your CV is atrocious. And you'll very rarely get good, honest feedback about your CV. If you do treasure it, it's really valuable, and act upon it. But most people are afraid. Employers certainly won't go anywhere near to saying it. They'll say it to the recruiter or their HR contact, but they won't say it to your face. And most recruiters will shy away from it because it's not their job. They would just want to make a placement. And if you're one of 150 applicants with a really bad CV, they don't really want to get embroiled in that discussion. And that's fair enough. That's not what they're being paid to do. It would be nice to have the feedback, but it's hard to get. So always keep your eye on those stats. If you're getting 0 interviews or very few interviews, I can virtually guarantee, as long as you're applying for relevant jobs, the CV is the problem, and therefore you have it. That is a problem right now. It's not going to go away. The only way that will change is if the market becomes so supplier-led, i.e. there's lots and lots of jobs and very few candidates, you might then start getting interviews. But in the current economic climate, it's probably indicative of your CV being a real problem, and you're just not getting people's attention. And I would plead with you that whatever you do, if you're in that situation, you're not getting the interest, do something, like that guy who sent us an email. Don't think things will change. Don't wait for something to change. It won't. not anytime soon, not until the market dynamics change massively. And then you've got the option. You either do something yourself, and tonight will help, or you get professional help. And people like us exist, and obviously we'd like you to use us. Okay, so that gives you hopefully some checks. If you're interestingly, and just for those that aren't active in the marketplace right now, obviously all those measures apply when you're in the marketplace, or you can start thinking now, if I'm going to go in the marketplace in 2, 3, 5 months' time, turn of the year, whatever, is what this chap's saying on the webinar actually striking a chord? And if it is, if you're thinking, I don't think I'm going to be best placed in the marketplace, do something about it before you need to get into the marketplace. Don't spend too long assessing those statistics, applying for lots of jobs, and then saying months later, that guy was right, you know, I'm not getting the interest, I'm not getting the interviews, my CV must be pants, now I'll do something about it retrospectively. Don't harm your chances by waiting. Do something ahead of time. And if you're experiencing problems, do something now. So the biggest message from all that lot, the single biggest message really is make sure your CV builds a business case, the justification as to why somebody should interview you. Now we're going to talk about what you should actually do to fix the problem. How do you build a business case? What should we do? What's on the screen right now is not necessarily what you should do without any variability, but it is a good, effective structure for a CV. It doesn't matter if your CV's not in this order of sections. That's not really the message. The message is, we know if you follow this kind of logical flow on a CV, whatever you call the headings, and we'll go into each of these in turn, some more briefly than others. But if you follow this kind of flow, it's a good way of structuring a CV. The top 3 sections are key to forming this business case that I keep waffling on about. So we get these bits right, and unsurprisingly, these are the 3 areas we're going to spend most of the session on. Get these 3 areas right with the right content, then you'll have built a very strong business case as to why somebody should be interested in you. Now, this key word there is content. So if you structured your CV with these headings and then filled it with absolute drivel, it's not going to make one iota of difference to your chances of getting an interview. So it is all about the content. The structure is just exactly that. It's a structure. It's a sort of a flow that makes sense. But the most important information is what actually fills each of these sections. So we'll take a look at each of these in turn. So again, thinking about your own CV, many people will have what they're currently calling either a professional summary, a professional profile, a personal profile, personal statement, sometimes a career objective, sometimes an executive summary. Again, it doesn't really matter what you're calling it within reason. What is really important is what follows underneath. And if you've got some kind of opening statement on your CV, so maybe you've got your name, a lot of people will have personal details, so their name, address, maybe even date of birth, marital status. Now, our view is junk a lot of that to the back of the CV for reasons that will become clear later. But you need your name, of course, you need some contact details, but then you need to get into the nub of the matter. You need to start building the business case. Where you live, whether you're married, when you were born, if you're putting that on your CV, is not building a business case. It's all irrelevant information in the great scheme of things. So you need to cut to the chase and get stuck into this business case straight away. It's the most important thing to do on your CV. So if you've got one of those kind of opening statements, think hard about what's in it at the moment and then compare it to some of the things I'm just about to talk about. The very first thing you need to be doing is actually stating what you are. Now, at first glance you might think, well, what on earth's that about? But I bet most people don't do that. Most people talk about lots of behavioural things. So I'm enthusiastic, committed, passionate. I can work well in a team or as an individual. I'm dynamic. I can give 110%. Or, you know, my objective is to achieve this. All me, I. Or claiming lots of skills that you think are important to your target audience, like enthusiasm, interpersonal skills, dedication, commitment, but actually are wholly impossible to prove on the CV. If you can prove on a CV how enthusiastic you are, then I will send you £5. So send me your name and details with an explanation of how enthusiastic you are, and I'll send you £5. If I can find a way of justifying whether you're more or less enthusiastic than somebody else who does the same thing. It's actually impossible. You can't do it, not reliably. So things like that mean nothing. What you need to do on your CV, if you're applying for, let's say, a project management role, you need to say that you are a project manager. If you're applying for a finance director role, you need to say that you're a senior financial professional or a finance director if you're already one, or you use a generic title that's close to your actual title or level that you're at, but reflects the level of the role you're applying for. To exaggerate a point, going back to that example I gave, which is a bit tongue-in-cheek, if you're applying to be a nuclear submarine captain and you start your CV by saying, I'm a really personable, enthusiastic checkout operator, guess how long somebody's going to give your application? Answer, not very long, of course. Now, if you narrow that a bit and make it less ridiculous, the same principles apply. Not many people realise, first of all, how many job applicants there are for every job, certainly in the UK and most of Western Europe right now. It's normally in the very high tens, regularly in the hundreds, and sometimes we had a chap from Michael Page Finance help us out with a webinar a week ago, and he actually did a sort of guest spot to give people a little bit of real-life recruiter information. There was a fairly senior role. It was a finance director role. 1,500 people in the UK applied for that job. Now, the problem is, with 1,500 bits of paper, be that digitally or printed, it's an awful lot of information to have to go through. Whether you've got machines to do it, computers, or you're doing it visually, doesn't matter. It's an awful lot of data. And the problem within that is, of that 1,500 people, there were quite a few housewives, bin men, welders, all sorts. And there's no disrespect to any of those three professions, but they were no way qualified to do the job. And what's worse is they were making it very difficult for the recruiter to even figure out what they were. And if they were stating what they were opening up with their CV almost as brash as, yeah, I am a welder looking to get into a new line of work, really think I could be a finance director kind of statement. I mean, really ridiculous. You know, whatever the person's situation is, you can't be applying for jobs with that kind of statement. So if that's the case, if a recruiter and an employer potentially is looking at all of these people, a good proportion of which are totally invalid and shouldn't be applying for the job, you don't want to be judged with that brush. You don't want to be harshly judged because you haven't made it clear that you are actually a valid applicant for the role. So the very first thing to do on your CV is make sure you are screaming from the rooftops, I am a valid applicant for this role. And the way you do that is by stating that you are pretty much what you are and what they're looking for. If you can claim that. Obviously, if you can't claim it, you ought to question whether you should be applying for the job because you're unlikely to get much interest. Linked to that, fourth are we up to now, cliche of the evening, value proposition. What is your value proposition? So if we're building a business case to your target audience and we're suggesting that you should be interviewed because of the strength and values that you could bring to that particular employer, they're going to be investing an amount of money in you. If it's on a contract basis, a day rate or an hourly rate. If it's a permanent role, it's going to be a salary. It's going to be in the several £1,000s, maybe hundreds of £1,000s. Whoever's doing the recruiting or whoever's looking to fill that role, the employer is going to want a return on that investment. Your value proposition is in effect a big clue in terms of how you're going to return that investment. Why are you on this planet right now doing the job that you are? What value can you bring to the employer as a consequence of them employing you? Why should they be investing X number of £1,000 in you? That's your value proposition. I'll show you an example shortly, and I'll also be showing you how this all fits together on a CV shortly as well. Linked to that is a handful of things that you're very good at, things that help justify why you, again, should be considered a valid applicant for the role. And unsurprisingly, those sort of go together and form a strong opening statement that is aligned to the hot skills that the marketplace is looking for that kind of job. So those are the things you should have in an opening statement. If it hasn't got those kind of things, you're probably not making a very good opening gambit for your business case. Here's an example. Again, you can read it at your own leisure. It's for a fairly senior person, finance director, but don't let that bother you. It's got nothing to do with level of person. So a supermarket checkout operator, and I only pick that example because my son actually does that as a part-time job at the moment whilst he's at college, so it's an easy one that comes to mind. I don't know anybody, incidentally, who's a nuclear submarine captain, but let's forget about the level of seniority or how much experience you've got. A fresh graduate could write one of these things. They just change the content. I remember I said it's all about content. So you think about who you're sending a CV to, you think about the job that you're applying for. Normally those things are all relative. So a graduate is not going to be applying to be a finance director. A graduate is going to be applying to go into a graduate entry scheme or some kind of junior role or internship. And so they pitch their message accordingly. Finance director, of course, much more senior level, they're pitching their message accordingly. So it's always possible to write one of these opening statements for anybody, anywhere, at any level, in any country, with any level of experience or lack of experience. It just doesn't matter. So a lot of people say to us, oh yeah, but I'm not at this level, this sounds too professional. Forget that. As I say, a graduate who's got no work experience at all could write something like this, or we could write it on their behalf. And it becomes a far more compelling opening statement to your CV. So this one here, it's describing what they are. They're a finance director. What's their value proposition? Well, it all hangs around that protecting cash flow and profitability statement. What are they good at? There's a list of things, starting with key strengths include, and we have to assume for the purposes of tonight that all this statement's aligned with the hot skills in the marketplace, but it would seem to be so. It seems to read well. Now you'll notice in this statement there is nothing about enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, interpersonal skills, communication skills, working in a team or as an individual. Most of those things are behavioural traits. They're admirable skills, so don't get me wrong. It's not as if an employer is not looking for those things, but an employer will not judge your CV or be looking on your CV for proof of your enthusiasm and interpersonal skills. They'll judge that at a much later stage in the process, at interview or at assessment centre. And that's where people get mixed up. They read the job advert and they think, oh yeah, they're looking for enthusiasm and communication skills and interpersonal skills, so I'll put that on my CV and that's it, job done. And I'm aligning it with the hot skills in the marketplace. You're not. You're aligning your CV to the wrong skills in the marketplace, and they're not going to be assessed until much later in the process. So your CV needs to get you the interview. Once you're at interview, you go about addressing a whole heap of different issues, and they're mostly the behavioural ones. So that's really important. So this opening statement should have nothing about behavioural skills. Really, really important. So that's the first of the three things that I said would build a business case on your CV, the opening statement. Second thing, after we've gone through this section, I'll show you a real-life example. We call this area key skills, areas of expertise, or some such, and it's really just a nifty way of providing to your audience a menu of the skills that you have. So aesthetically it looks quite good because it's going to be a series of bullet points on the CV, not too many, not too few, but just reflecting the skills that that audience are actually looking for. It works well in two ways. As I say, aesthetically it works well because whoever's reading the CV, their eyes will be drawn to it. It will reflect back, if you've done it properly, it will reflect back the skills the market's actually looking for. It also works well, particularly well in fact, for SEO, search engine optimization, for those wondering what that means, but digitally basically. So as soon as your CV leaves your outbox or whatever, it's going to hit a database of some sort. It's either going to be a job board database, a recruiter's internal database, an employer's application tracking system or database, or any combination of all of those things and more besides, including LinkedIn. As soon as it does that, it'll be indexed. Various tools will search it for keywords and phrases, and then recruiters, employers, HR folk will be searching their various databases or databases they subscribe to through job boards. And unless you've applied for a specific role for which your CV will be judged accordingly, there's a strong chance that people can find you if you get the content right because of the keywords and phrases you're using. So again, this is why this hot skill thing is really important. If you get it right, your CV becomes much more searchable. If you get it wrong, you'll probably never appear, or you'll be so far down the running order list that nobody will ever give you a second glance. Here are a few examples. Again, it doesn't matter what level you're at, how much experience you've got, how little experience you've got, you tweak all of this to suit. If you've just graduated, and you're going to market for your first job, yes, of course, you won't have lots of commercial technical skills. So you flip it and you look for broader skills that people might be looking for. If you've got any experience, then of course you try and look and find out what the skills that the employer is looking for. Again, technical and functional skills, not behavioural ones. So you don't stick in here anything to do with enthusiasm, team working skills, commitment, passion. All of that's ridiculous. You don't need that on the CV. It's of no benefit at all. So you put things like project management, VAT returns, such and such a software tool, such and such a software package, things like that, Prince 2 project management, or AMP project management qualified, or something like that. Now I'll show you an example of a CV that has these two sections. So this is the second section of the CV that I said would really be important to building a business case. Just before I do that, to reinforce a point that I mentioned earlier, a comment in red at the bottom of this slide, the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers will and can only make their decision on who to interview based on the contents of your CV. Now, again, a lot of people tend to think, well, of course, how else are they going to do it? Ignoring the fact that the most important message there is that that is the only means they have to judge you. If you send somebody a pile of rubbish, that is how they'll see you, a pile of rubbish. If you send somebody an absolutely steaming hot gem, i.e. a great business case of a CV, that's how they'll judge you. They don't know you from Adam. Most of them don't anyway. They can only judge you based on what you've sent them. And if you send them something that they're not expecting to see or is very hard for them to assimilate or assess, do not be surprised to be too successful. It won't happen. People will reject you or find you easy ways to reject your application. So consequently, there's two things there really, one of which is it really stresses the importance of the content of the CV. If you get that right, it will make a difference. If you get it wrong, you'll never get interviews or very rarely get interviews. But the other thing is, and not to get confused with this, don't ever take rejection personally, because it's nothing to do with you as an individual other than your reflection of the skills on your CV. So what you should take to heart is the fact that somebody's judged you based on probably a poor set of information, but they don't know you personally. So it cannot be a personal reflection. It's not a judgment on you and your skills. It's a judgment about how you're communicating them to the marketplace. Now, for the mathematicians amongst you, the difference between 100% of recruiters and hiring managers and 92%, i.e. 8%, that is people who know the individual. So it's not always the case that people can only judge you based on your CV. Some recruiters may already know you, and they might decide positively to interview you because they already know you and the CV is less relevant. Some employers or recruiters may have been giving your name through word of mouth, and therefore the CV becomes far less important. But in the vast majority of cases, the only means people have to assess you is what you send them on your CV. Okay, let's look at a real-life example. So on the screen, anytime soon, because it will take just a little while to refresh, you can see a CV of Matt Craven. Matt Craven is the guy that runs our business. This CV is real. It's a couple of years old now, but it doesn't matter. He's still doing the same job. Structurally, it follows the sections that I highlighted earlier that we've been talking about so far. So he's opening up with a summary. It's describing what Matt is, what his value proposition is, which essentially is being able to drive superior interview and job offer rates, what he's very good at, and we're assuming again that's aligned with the hot skills in his particular marketplace. Now he's a bit unusual because his CV is really a bit fictitious in the sense that he's not actually looking for a job first of all, and of course running his own business is slightly different from if you're an employee, but the effect is the same. He's got to justify potentially to an audience that might be interested in using his services, he's got to justify why on earth he's on this planet and what he's on this planet to do, and why would somebody be interested in him. Notice there's nothing there about enthusiasm, dedication, commitment, passion, team working, working as an individual, none of that nonsense. And there wouldn't be on any CV that we wrote for an individual. Then there's an area that Matt's called expertise, but could be called key skills or areas of expertise. Again, the name's not important, the content is. And under there are a few bullet points, probably as many as you'd want. He's gone 7 down the left, 7 down the right. That's as many as you'd probably want on a CV, or an average CV anyway. And he's highlighting key things that we know people search for, terminology that's searched for digitally, that makes sense visually, and you can see it just attracts the eye, and it sort of reinforces. If you get this right, it's strange. Psychologically, all it's doing is saying, you're looking for X, Y, and Z. Guess what? I've got X, Y, and Z. That's what it's there to do. Not trying to be clever with it or say things that aren't true. It's just trying to get in the head of whoever's doing this initial filtering, thinking, what are they actually looking for? Have I got that in my toolkit? Yes, I have. I'm going to put it down, makes a match. You'd be surprised how effective such a simple thing is. So those are the two sections. Lurking at section 3, the career highlights, is what we're going to come on to very shortly. But that's 2 out of the 3 sections that really build this business case. Let's take a look at the 3rd section, career highlights. You could see this as achievements, if you like. So if you've got on your CV right now any kind of achievement, that's good. There are a few warning signs to look out for. They've got to be relevant achievements and appropriate for your target audience. But it is good to highlight things that you've actually done. If you were harsh at this moment in time about Matt's CV or anybody's CV that I've sort of loosely described, you could say, okay, well, we're making some claims about the individual. We're hopefully establishing in the reader's mind that they're a valid applicant, that they've got something relevant to offer, and they've got skills that seem to reflect what I'm interested in. So you can imagine psychologically the recruiter or hiring manager thinking, yeah, this seems right. There's reasons for me to keep reading. I'm sort of hooked. But if you're harsh, you could say, well, where's the evidence? Where's the proof? Career highlights is the bit that gives people the proof. Now, this is where we spend most of the time with individuals when we're writing their CV, and it's the hardest bit to get right, whether we're doing it or you're doing it as an individual. And the reason why it's hard is because most people are fairly modest about what they've actually done, but most people find it hard to articulate what they've done to a third party. It's just one of those human quirks. So writing ability, being able to put together good, compelling content is really important. If you're good at that, this should be quite an easy task. If you're not, I wouldn't fight it. I'd get help. And we use a methodology to construct these highlights called STAR. It's not our invention. This exists in many walks of life, and there are other things similar to it. But we use STAR. It stands for Situation, Task, Actions, Result. It's a useful methodology to construct good, compelling content that doesn't waffle on for ages, but gives enough meat on the bone for people to be interested in you as an individual or what you're talking about. Incidentally, we're going to use it and talk about it in the context of writing a CV. But if you get good at this mechanic, as we'll see soon, it's a really useful way of dealing with competency-based interviews and answering questions of that ilk, as you'll see shortly. So let me show you an example. This is actually off Matt's CV. Again, I'm not going to read it. You can look at it yourselves whilst I rattle on. But it's a paragraph. It'll become important or obvious shortly why this is important about the length and the size of this text. But this is one example from Matt's career, which he's going to highlight on his CV, and it provides proof to back up the skills that he's claimed to have earlier on his CV. So in the professional summary and the bullet points, he's made certain claims about his abilities. This is one example of how he's put those into practice. So you can see the situation is the first sentence. It's the scene setter, the headline news, the description, if you like, of the overall situation, which is that Iraq Enterprise Rent-A-Car, that stands for, just so you know, acquired an unprofitable competitor that basically needed sorting out. And the task is the responsibility resting on Matt's shoulders at that moment in time. So he was an operations manager and he needed to sort it out, basically. The actions are the bulk of the remaining text. That's a series of things that he did to effect change. And the result is the final sentence, which is that he succeeded in sorting it out, achieving a level of profitability within a certain time scale. That, literally a nutshell, is a really good example of something that he did in his career, relevant to the skills being sought by the marketplace we're imagining, relevant to the skills he's claiming he's got, the proof positive that in effect he can effect change and make a difference. It's quite powerful. A few words of caution about these things. As I've already highlighted, if you're going to pick examples to focus on your CV, They need to be strong examples, not weak. If they're weak, they highlight failure. More importantly, or as importantly, they need to be relevant and targeted to your audience. So if you are in IT, for example, and you really think that the most impressive thing that you ever did was to launch Windows 95 across 25 desktops, then whilst that might have been impressive at the time, it's not really going to hit the market with a storm right now. I don't know of anybody who still uses Windows 95, and for a fair few people, Windows 95 might be, what on earth's that, other than a logical extrapolation of the dates and the brand name. So you've got to pick your examples well, and you'll be surprised how many people get this hideously wrong. What people often do is they pick the thing they enjoyed the most, and that's not the same as what your target audience is actually looking for. So that's why this is not so easy. People think, oh yeah, I remember the time I did this, that was really impressive, and fail to link it to what the target audience is actually looking for. So you're not helping to build a business case if you pick examples that aren't strong or are irrelevant. In fact, you're damaging your chances, because it actually looks to the reader that you couldn't be bothered to think of a relevant example, and almost, in the worst possible situation, is that you're insulting their intelligence by picking examples that have no relevance to their needs. So it can work spectacularly badly if you pick the wrong examples. Don't worry too much about, again, some people say, yeah, but I've not saved a business, I've not changed the world, I've not rescued people, I've not done superhuman things. Don't worry about that. It's all relative normally. If you're in a job which you think is fairly menial, administrative, you're a small cog in a massive gearbox, don't worry about that. The kind of jobs you're applying for probably aren't expecting you to change the world, but people will want to see evidence of your ability to do the things that the new job will be asking of you. So don't worry about the end result. Don't worry about the KPI bit. You know, well, I haven't sold things, or I haven't generated huge amounts of profitability, or I haven't saved the company 4 million quid in running costs. That's not the point. You pick examples that are relevant to your target audience. And as I've hinted at, we tend to spend most of the time, and therefore we earn our keep most discussing this area with our clients. It's really important. Let me show you Matt's CV again before we move on to some of the other sections of the CV. So if I just shrink the resolution slightly, or the zoom slightly, you'll now see on the screen the 3 areas that make Matt's business case. So we open up with the summary. What is he? What's his value proposition? What's he good at? Linking it to the hot skills in the marketplace. We're reinforcing elements of those hot skills with the bullet points, and we're then saying, here's the proof. Here's 3 examples. 3 is the magic number here, for reasons that will become clear shortly. 3 examples of Matt's ability to do the things that he's claimed to be good at. Interestingly, also notice the 3 examples, one of them is dated, but the others aren't. There's no compulsion to date them. They're in no chronological order. They're in no particular order at all. In fact, the order they should be in is relevance to your target audience. So you lead with the example that would seem to present the best example you could possibly come up with, most relevant example, and then second and third, or if they're equally weighted, it doesn't matter what order they're in, of course. The other thing here is that, so the message behind that, sorry, is that by escaping the chronological order, you can pull from any period of your life any example that you judge to be a highlight, as long as it is relevant to your target audience. Now, jumping ahead slightly, the example we looked at, Enterprise Rent-A-Car, which is the second career highlight on the screen on Matt's CV, that's actually from the period of life early in Matt's career in the 90s. So he's still justifying it and thinking, okay, it's still a good, strong example of my abilities, but it happened a long time ago. Time's not an issue. It's not mentioned here. And you can escape from that chronological trap by using these highlights. Now, there's 1 or 2 contractors on this evening, I noticed. This area of the CV, if you're an out-and-out contractor, you've contracted for many years, you intend to go forward contracting for many years, adopting this format on the CV is a really helpful way, because if you're a contractor and you've performed lots of short-term roles, and if you listed them all, it would look like an unholy mess. You have a very long CV, and it would look like you job hopped all over the place, particularly to recruiters who don't understand the contract market and think you're some kind of glorified temp. If you fall into that kind of compartment, if you like, or segment, then we have a slight twist on this theme, and when we're writing CVs for contractors, we can make it far more case study based, so career highlight based, and have lots of career highlights. You pick the ones that are relevant, you go to market with the ones you think are most relevant, and you escape the chronological track. You deal with the chronological order elsewhere. If there are any contractors who are in that, they've literally been contracting for a while, you intend to contract going forward, if you put a question in the box, I'll show you an example of Matt's CV converted to contractor style later, right at the end of the session. But there is a really effective way of managing that. If you have largely been in permanent work and either want to continue on the permanent employment route, or you might consider contract work but have got a predominantly permanent career, this format of CV works best. And that is opening statement, bullet points, 3 career highlights. The other point I was going to make is they're all equally weighted size-wise. You notice that each highlight's the same size. Really important that if you start, which most people tend to do if they're going to list any achievements, they tend to start with what they think is their best, and they give it loads of space. The second one then is half the space, and then the third and subsequent ones are less and less space. And it just looks like the ones at the end are afterthoughts. You couldn't be bothered. It really does look like that. If you ask recruiters and employers, tell me which is the most important thing, tell me the one that people probably weren't too bothered about, that's the response you'll get. And if you just listen to people, they'll think, oh, they couldn't be bothered, could they? Or they've run out of steam. That's the impression it gives. So be very careful with how you, even subtle things like the space you give to things, be very careful with the message you're sending. Okay, other sections of the CV, very briefly, before we move into LinkedIn. You'll have noticed, well, I'll show you on Matt's CV, but you'll have noticed so far we've not actually said where Matt's been working. Where has he got all this experience from? So if your CV opens up much earlier than I've shown you so far with who you're currently working for or who you've most recently worked for, that's another bad indicator. It's highly unlikely that the most differentiating thing about you, that the strongest bit about your business case is where you're currently working. That's not to say that where you're working is not important, but it's not the most important thing for most people. So you haven't bought the right to get an interview if all you're doing is saying, here am I, this is my name, this is my qualifications, this is where I'm currently working. That's not differentiating. That's just a list of stuff. And if you work for somebody who nobody has ever heard of, or has a bad image in the marketplace, all you're doing is raising that higher and higher up in somebody's mind because it's the first thing they see or amongst the first details they see. So conversely, if you work for a company that nobody's ever heard of or has a bad reputation for whatever reason in the marketplace, it makes sense to put it further down the batting order. It works better for you. But we do need to explain where on earth you've been working as an individual, and indeed we do that on the CV. I'll show you Matt's example shortly. It's still on page 1, interestingly, just at the bottom of page 1 rather than the top. And you need to go in reverse chronological order, so you start with the most recent and work back. But don't put detail beyond 10 years. It's not appropriate or relevant. You'll not get an interview based on what happened in the 80s or 90s if you were working then. You need to explain that. I'll come on to how you do that later. But the detail, only the last roughly 8 to 10 years. There are some exceptions to that rule, but as a broad indicator, that's what you need to focus on. And by detail, I mean a little bit of background. Who on earth are you working for? Don't assume that anybody knows that, even for big brands. Because big brands have different divisions and sister companies and all sorts of relationships. You don't know what the recruiter's thinking of when they see your employer name. So give some explanation. A little bit about the duties and responsibilities you have, but not that much. Don't dump your job description into your CV, because most job descriptions look pretty much the same for most jobs. Therefore, if that's what you're going to market with, again, you're just in that list of things category. Focus on the achievements, the things that make a difference, that you've made a difference with, the things that differentiate you from most other people, because you're explaining what you've actually done as opposed to what you've been paid to do. As far as the earlier career, so if you have a career that's more than 10 years roughly old, yes, you need to document it, but just a line. So literally, as we'll see on Matt's example shortly, from this date to that date, employer name, job title, end of. Nothing else. To get an interview, as I say, it's not important what you were doing in 1990, 1980 or 1970 something. I'm suggesting here, and this is not controversial, but not what normally people do. Qualifications, professional development, we tend to put towards the back of the CV. If you're degree educated, if you've got an MBA, if you're Prince 2 qualified, or you have any other professional or high-end educational academic qualification, you can mention that in your opening summary. So remember we said that I showed you that example of a finance director, and that's what they were, and their value proposition was loosely around protecting cash flow and profitability. I showed that opening statement of a finance director. If they were ACCA qualified, which is a qualification within accountancy, they could say an ACCA qualified finance director. That's how you get the message across about your key educational or professional training development accreditations. You don't go into detail. That's not differentiating. So there are thousands, hundreds, tens of thousands, whatever the number is, of degrees, of graduates. So just saying that you're a graduate, making that the first thing that you put on your CV almost, is not helping your cause. There are other more subtle ways of getting that message across. If you're a Prince 2 qualified project manager, you can say that in your opening statement. You don't need to detail all of that on the first page of your CV, because you'll be up against lots of other people that are Prince 2. So giving space to the least valuable attributes, or the things that are almost commodity-like, is not going to help build your business case. So we tend to shunt all the detail towards the back of the CV, and we put the highest level of educational academic qualifications only, not all the detail. So how many O-levels you have or GCSEs, if you've got a degree, is not valid unless you're specifically asked. Ditto personal details. So this is slightly more controversial, because most people put on the top of their CV on page 1, as I said, their name, where they live, and all the other paraphernalia about their personal information. Now, most of that's not actually needed, and you certainly don't want to lead with necessarily where you live and all those other bits and pieces. It's not important. It's not going to get you an interview. In fact, in some cases, it's proven to get people rejected because somebody's decided they live too far away, or you might be quite happy to relocate or spend a week somewhere near to the office and then go back home at weekends. But if you can't convey that on the CV, somebody misjudges it and think, well, we're not paying relocation, we can't expect this person to commute that far, therefore we'll reject them because they're not living in the right place. So don't make it easy for people. Put the personal details towards the back of the CV. Again, it's not the differentiating thing you'd like it to be. On a similar theme, I can virtually guarantee most people will have, who are on this evening's session, will have references available on request on their CV or something similar. And again, I'd implore, ask yourself, why do you put that on the CV? Probably because that's the way you've already done it, always done it. Probably because you followed some guidance which says you should do it somewhere. But where's the logic for that? It's not going to get you any interviews, unless, and the only exception is, unless you've specifically been asked to submit it on your CV, and then it will be actual references. It won't be. You can only be successful in getting an interview if you have the words references available on request on your CV. That just doesn't happen. There is no logic. It's a bad habit. It's an urban myth. So don't put it on your CV. Don't waste your space. It's not the worst crime of the century. It's just a pointless exercise. Far more powerful to put on your CV actual testimonial evidence of somebody who's actually hired you or managed you. We call them recommendations. They're very similar to the kind of stuff you find on LinkedIn these days, more of it shortly. So you could sort, if you have recommendations and they're powerful and compelling, you could literally pinch them off LinkedIn and dump them on your CV. I'll show you where shortly. So yes, the only exception to that is if people ask for references and you have to provide them, then so be it. But the process for getting references will exist whether you have them on request or not. So at some point in the process, you will be asked for references if you've gotten through to a particular level of the interview process. It doesn't matter what you've put on CV, because most people have forgotten it by then, that you will be asked for references at that moment in time. The other controversial element slightly is hobbies and interests. Now, our general recommendation is you just don't put them on your CV. They add no value. The only exception to this is where they could add value, and you have to ask yourself the question, is my target audience looking for evidence of my ability to like films, bake cakes, or walk dogs? If you think you will get an interview based on those criteria, then go ahead and put them on your CV. But if you think that any of those could be perceived as being insular, introverted pursuits, It doesn't matter whether they are or not, and whether you go on your own or not doesn't make any difference. If they could be perceived as such, they might actually harm your chances more than you might imagine. There are exceptions to the rule. I once worked with an individual who was a salesman selling widgets, let's say, who desperately wanted to go and sell aquatic supplies because he was passionately interested in fish and all things aquatic. So he left that on his CV. It actually got him an interview because he would appear to have been a strong salesperson. That was the key attribute, with a passion for the subject matter that the company was interested in. So it can work, but in some cases it can work against you. So think carefully about hobbies and interests. So, brief moment of reflection. You should now have enough information before we talk about LinkedIn and a few other final bits and pieces. If you're in the market actively and you're getting interviews and you're happy with that interview rate and you think it will lead to second interviews, assessment centres, job offers, happy days. You don't need to do anything, or you probably don't need to do anything. But if you're concerned that you're not getting the level of interest that you think you should be getting, and if you're already getting no interviews at all, and therefore you're failing to meet this acid test, so the interview to application ratio that we talked about earlier, then of course that's a warning sign to you, and it's probably because you're not building this business case. You're not establishing in the mind of your CV's reader that you are a valid applicant with something to offer. You might technically be absolutely the best candidate for the role, but there's plenty of people who are technically the best people for the role who have gone uninterviewed because their CV was truly atrocious and didn't reflect that ability. And if you're not providing the business case to your audience, it's probably because you're not providing any evidence to support it. So you've got some measures now. You can ask yourself the question, do a bit of diagnosis and think, is my CV truly addressing these things? Now, occasionally we come across somebody who doesn't actually achieve any of these things, yet still gets some interviews for some strange reason. And it's normally because there's something on the CV that does trigger a positive response. So there are always exceptions to the rule. It's a very subjective area. And I could probably point to a handful of people that I've reviewed CVs for, and technically I really lay into them and say that is an atrocious CV because, yet there was some little gem on it that in some people's eyes was enough to generate an interview because they had a particular skill. It could be a technical skill, software knowledge. They had some quality that stood out. So that may be true. You could have a bad CV but still get interviews because there was something on it, but that then becomes a good CV. It's working. So the acid test always, whatever anybody tells you about your CV, is it getting interviews? If it's getting interviews, good. If it's not getting interviews or not enough interviews, you have to do something about it. And as I hinted at earlier, if you're not getting the interviews, then surely doing nothing is the least attractive option. You have to do something. The only people who should be doing nothing are the ones who are quite happy with the interview success rate. And then the other two options, you either get somebody to sort it for you, or you do something yourself and then evaluate the results. But whatever you do, if you're in that problem area, do something. Now, for those people starting to think, okay, well, I might be prepared to engage the services of these guys who might be able to help me. If you stick around until the end, which is not far off now, one of the benefits of attending these webinars, apart from all the high-quality information that you get, is you get some free discounts, some free services, big discounts on our services, which I'll detail very shortly. Just a couple of other things on the CV before we hit LinkedIn. I won't go through all of these as time is tight now. Spelling, most people talk about this, but still surprising how many people get the spelling wrong on the CV. If you make a spelling mistake or a grammatical error on your CV, it's almost certainly going to get rejected, and nobody's going to give that recruiter or HR person a hard time for doing so, however good a candidate you may be. It's just too easy to say, I rejected this CV because of a spelling mistake, and the hiring manager saying, fine, I agree, that's what we should be doing. The market's too competitive for anything else to occur at this moment in time. The other thing I wanted to talk about very briefly is the number of pages a CV should have. There is a bit of an urban myth about this. If you've got good content, well-structured CV that addresses the need of your target audience, to be brutally honest, most people in that situation, they couldn't give a monkey's how long your CV was, whether it's 1 page or, within reason, 4 or 5 pages. Obviously, if it was 8, 9, 10 pages, it would be ridiculous. Nobody's ever going to read it all. That doesn't mean to say you wouldn't get an interview, though, interestingly. It might not help your cause, but if all of the content was on page 1 and 2, it still might have done its job. What people detest is bad CVs, however long or short they are. That's the real great. And what tends to have happened is that over time people have said CVs, generally speaking, are poor. That's why a lot of public sector and large-scale employers force you to fill in application forms to justify why they should interview you and ask you for evidence. If you ever filled out one of those forms, you'll know the kind of stuff I mean. You know, answer in less than 500 words, and give us an example of when this happened to you or how you dealt with a particular situation. All they're trying to do is desperately get evidence to make a decision on who to interview you, because they know most people's CVs are so poor. So what people tend to say is, I only want to see 2 pages of rubbish rather than 5 pages of rubbish. That's not the same as, please submit a CV that's only 2 pages. As I say, you could submit a CV of 4 pages, and if it was really high quality stuff, nobody's going to complain about it. Most CVs we write for people are probably 3 pages on average. Some are 2, some are 4, most are 3. Nobody's ever come back and said to us, you're a bunch of idiots, you've equipped me with a CV that's too long, and now I've failed in the marketplace. It's never happened. And the only exception to that rule is if somebody has specifically said to you in advance, please submit information on X number of pages or within X number of pages. But that rarely happens as well, in fairness. Okay, LinkedIn, very briefly. The important thing about LinkedIn is that it's important, unsurprisingly. It doesn't mean to say you have to have a LinkedIn profile. If you've got something against LinkedIn or being on social media, although social media is a bit of a misnomer, that's fine. We're not saying you must be on LinkedIn because it's the thing to do or it's trendy. If you're on it and you're using it, great. If you're not on it and considering how to use it, I'll give you a bit of insight, but I just wanted to give a bit of an overview, because most people, if they've got a CV and they're in commercial life, most people have got a LinkedIn profile. And my advice would be, generally, if you're looking to be recognized, if you want to get spotted and you want to build a profile and have people approach you about jobs and to gain credibility, it's probably a good thing to be on. But I wouldn't say you have to be on it. It's certainly not the law, so to speak. Important thing about LinkedIn is that, you know, I said the vast majority of recruiters and hiring managers would look at your CV before making an interview decision. Well, the vast majority of those would then go check you out on LinkedIn. They might check you out on other social media, so the proper social media, i.e. Facebook, Twitter. That's out with this evening's discussion, and it's far more personal and not to do with the job market. But if you've got a presence on any of those things, you need to be careful what you're doing, because that might get spotted by some employers. There are now people who will go and check all of those things for a fee, and most recruiters and employers will tend to look at them anyway. LinkedIn they'll certainly look at because it's a professional business network. The thing about LinkedIn is you don't have to be active on it. Once you've set up your presence, assuming that you stay in a job for a fair period of time, you don't need to take an active role in LinkedIn if you don't want to. But if you're going to be on it, make sure that what's on there is appropriate. Now, what people tend, you know, I said on the CV, there's a number of things if you're doing, they're warning signs. What then most people do is they've got a bad CV, they tend to then copy and paste it into LinkedIn, metaphorically speaking. So if you've got a bad CV and you dump it in LinkedIn, you've just doubled the badness, which is not a good thing, unsurprisingly. Just as with the CV, what you put into LinkedIn, not how much you put in, but the quality of what you put in is absolutely key. Do not get persuaded or suckered into thinking that the more information you put into LinkedIn, the better your chances will be. That's not necessarily true. LinkedIn will encourage you to submit everything about yourself for obvious reasons, and some not so obvious reasons, but that will not make your appeal to a potential recruiter or employer any more or less so. And probably it's actually, they'll make it less appealing, because the more you put in, you tend to give too much away. And again, it's not relevant to what your audience is looking for. So keep it brief, succinct, and build a business case again. That's what your LinkedIn should be doing. Now, very briefly, there's 3 sections that, again, if you get these right, it will help you rather than hinder you. The first one of those is what's called the professional headline. So if you know LinkedIn, it's the bit of text that appears under your name. I'll show you an example shortly. By default, LinkedIn recommends that it's your job title and current employer. That's not that helpful, because that's not helping build a business case. That's just telling people what you are. If you've got an odd job title, or it's a job title you don't really want to pursue in the future, it's maybe a junior role you've had to take recently, and you want to elevate yourself. Leading with, here's my name and this is what I'm currently doing, is not helping your cause, and it's certainly not helping your cause if you stick into that, if you overwrite that text with something like desperately looking now for a job, or currently seeking, or available now, or available immediately. That's not really that helpful. It doesn't sell your benefits. I'll show you an example shortly, as I said. The other thing that's important is a summary. So the bit of text that appears under your header, the header is the photo, the name, the professional headline, and sort of the location that you're at and the sector you work within. The next box underneath that is a sort of opening summary. That should be like this profile on the screen right now, Matt's, just so you see the relevance between the CV and his LinkedIn profile. So the professional headline is the bit that's highlighted in red, the bit under his name. So he's not putting there Matt Craven, Managing Director, CVIA Group, which is technically what it would say by default, because Managing Director on its own is not differentiating. It's saying one thing, but it's not saying everything, and the company he works for nobody's ever heard of in the great scheme of things. So it wouldn't add value. So what he's saying is that actually he's known for blah-de-blah-de-blah, driving success in the job market. A far more compelling message. Far more compelling. So that's a professional headline. You can change that. There are limits to the size of it, but you can change that. And we change that when we're writing people's profiles. The summary is the text. Now, it's not the same as a CV. In the CV, we use a different tense. We don't say I, or we don't call Matt by his name. It's written in third person. The CV is different. Why? Don't have time to go into this evening, but it is. To do it properly requires a different approach. Similar content, different approach. But that again is the what is he? What's he good at? What's his value proposition? Linking the hot skills in the marketplace. So those 2 areas are 2 of the most important bits to just build the right image and hook people when they're reading your profile. Jobs, I mean, it's important, but it isn't sort of the holy trinity, as it were. You need to put a little bit about your jobs, but they only need to be summaries, not loads and loads of detail. You don't want to give people everything about you. You want enough intrigue, if that's the right word, for people to think, yeah, this person could be right, I hope they're available. That's the ideal psychologically, rather than hitting people with all the information you could possibly hit them with and then wondering why you never get any calls. Projects is the 3rd most important part, which most people don't use on LinkedIn, interestingly. If you know LinkedIn, on screen now is my profile, because this is in edit mode, so I can't edit Matt's profile, of course. So if you go to your profile and you go edit profile, you'll see on the right-hand side of the screen, where I've highlighted now, it depends where it is, depending on how much information you've already put into LinkedIn. But there's an area called Projects down the right-hand side in edit mode. If you click on that, you get a screen like this. And you can, this is an area where you can pull across career highlights from the CV and dump it into LinkedIn, and it literally can be dumped this time. This is a good copy and paste thing. So remember that example of Matt's where he was at an enterprise rent-a-car, and he was the operations manager, and he effected some change and turned around the profitability of a business that Enterprise Rent-A-Car had acquired. So you could put in here the name of that project could be Business Turnaround or Dramatic Business, you know, a bit like a combination of a Sun headline with a Daily Telegraph headline, and sort of a halfway house. Nice, compelling, punchy title. You put that in there, and then you put the text, so the bit about him, you know, the STAR methodology bit, remember that we talked about? You'd stick that in here. And you could put quite a large number of these. For contractors, it's absolutely brilliant, because you can put projects that you've worked on, irrespective of how many projects were in one contract. You could load up this with loads of those projects and then either just pick and choose which ones you have on display or have the whole lot. And on the CV you'd pick and choose, but on LinkedIn you might have the whole lot. So really good evidence of your abilities to deliver. Then final comment on LinkedIn. By default, the sections that LinkedIn orders and gives you is okay, but not ideal. You can reorder the sections. It's all drag and drop, or most of it is. We would recommend a slightly better order that builds the business case, because by default, if you start adding projects to your profile, they appear at the bottom of your profile, and they really should be much higher up the batting order. Okay, almost done. So an extension of the thought, if you started to think, okay, I need to do something, and if then those few of those have branched off and thought, right, I can't be bothered to do it myself, or I don't think I've got the skills, and I certainly don't have the time, maybe I should be thinking about getting somebody to help me with this. If you're going down that path, then very briefly, what happens is if we're involved in the process and you engage our services, then we rewrite your CV and LinkedIn profile from scratch. There is no such thing as amending or tweaking a CV. It just can't be done. You've either got a good CV or it's a CV that needs sorting out. And if it needs sorting out, it needs a root and branch approach. So we can do that. The way we do that and the mechanic behind it is that we can do all of this over the telephone, and we can extract out of you in the nicest possible way all of the raw data we need through an interview, which typically lasts somewhere between an hour to 2 hours. So it's not work of the moment, needs a bit of thought, but it's a really effective process to get all the raw data out of you. And during that process, we can help sort of sanitize the direction you're heading in. So if you say, yeah, you want to do this, we can say, yeah, okay, we can see that. There's some clear evidence to support it. That makes sense to us. We can make this happen and help you, and we can have that conversation. If you don't already know it, most people tend not to be too good at this, interestingly. We can work out what your value proposition is and how you should be going to market with that. So if like your brand and how you should be selling yourself. We can obviously work out what your skills are, how you should be articulating those on the CV, therefore building a good, strong, effective business case as to why somebody should be interviewing you. And if you've got that stronger business case, then you will get more interviews. And as I said, it should be in the order of the 30 to 50% kind of range, sometimes more, sometimes a bit less, but on average 30 to 50%. And it helps because if you're getting more interviews for more jobs, and the other flip side is being you can actually, if you build a stronger business case, you can go for jobs that you might not have been able to get previously, so more senior jobs, and that's also quite a successful result that comes out of getting your business case sorted. If you can do those things, you can then figure out whether it's worth investing some money in or not, because you can do the maths. And if you're interested in that, I promised you, for those that have hung on, a special offer. So there's two elements to this. Baseline, I'm afraid, if you do get us involved in writing your CVs, like any other professional service, it's going to cost money. Ordinarily, to write your CV and LinkedIn profile for anybody with more than 7 years work experience, if you've got less than 7 years work experience, then you probably need to talk to us separately. But most people who attend these webinars have got at least 7 years experience and sometimes a lot more than that. Whether you're a contractor or a permie, doesn't matter. But ordinarily it costs $349 plus VAT to do the two, and we'll reduce that for this evening for a limited time period to $275 plus VAT, so you're saving almost 90 quid. That offer is available until close of play this coming Friday, the 4th of April. I'll show you a page where you can get this offer shortly. However, I've got a slight twist because it's our month end, literally today. This rarely happens, it's fine-tuned, but anybody who's prepared to order. Now, when you order, you don't have to use the service. So if you're interested in this and want to park it for a month or two, that's fine. Some people do that. Some people buy the service at a discounted price and then wait for a month, 2 months. Somebody even waited 12 months for some bizarre reason. I'd say that's a bit extreme, but you could do it if you wanted to. So for those prepared to click on the button and pay the money by midnight tonight, we'll also give you a free cover letter, which is worth almost 40 quid, and access to our interview coaching system, which is an online system that you can practice interview questions and pre-select all sorts of questions about all sorts of subjects. It's a really great way of being able to assess your own abilities at interview questions, practice it in the privacy of your own home, and then watch your recording. Really clever system. That's worth quite a lot of money. In total, between the two, another 95 quid's worth of free services. But that is strictly limited to orders placed by the end of this evening, because obviously we get a financial gain from that. So I know that's tight, but that's why it's a good deal. Ordinarily, you'd not get this kind of deal. You need to visit this website if you're interested in that, and if you just bear with me, I'm going to mention, I'm just going to copy and paste the link to that website into the question facility and also the chat room box, just in case you need to pick it up from there, because you can't click at it on the screen. Okay. If you visit the website, just so you know, just in case if you do go there, this is what you'll see, just in case you're just a bit concerned, which is understandable. You know, a stranger shouting down the phone about CVs and money, but if you do want to go and buy any of our services, when you click on that link, you'll land on that page. It explains a bit more about the service. Obviously, it takes you through to a payment module, and the rest is very self-explanatory. As I say, what happens is then we get in touch with you, find out what you're trying to do, get the consultation sorted out over the telephone, and then the rest takes care of itself. Okay, that's it for the session in terms of presenting the content. I thank you very much for your time and attention, and I hope you got something out of that and found it useful. I promised I'd answer questions, so if you just bear with me, I'm just going to pause this thing,